Hey everybody, I'm Francesca Maximé and welcome to Inside Out with Natasha and Francesco. We're so happy to see you here today, and we have a brand new live show for you today. It's with Dr. Jessie Daniels, and she's going to be talking a lot about this whole phenomenon of Karens and what is it to be a woman in a white body with light or white skin racial privilege. And again, this is a show sort of for and by therapists, and we're really sort of trying to unpack embodied anti-racism, structural racism, personal racism. What does it mean? How does it show up in the therapy room? What do we do in the various sectors, whether it's at home, whether it's in our client settings, whether it's in, society at large, in our academic places? And we really are going to unpack a lot today. Jessie's a professor of sociology and critical social psychology at Hunter College and the Graduate Center, CUNY. She's the author and editor of 5, just short of a half dozen books, including Cyber Racism and Being a Scholar in the Digital Era, and blogs at Racism Review. She has a new book. Check out the title. I love it. Nice White Ladies, The Truth About White Supremacy, Our Role in It, and How We Can Help Dismantle It. And just loving everything about this. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Natashas Stovall, and she will engage more with Jessie. Thanks so much for joining us today, everybody.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. Thank you so much to Francesca, to Bryant, our producer, and Jessie, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us about your work, which I'm just so excited about and thrilled to be able to talk with you about today.
Thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
So why don't we start with sort of your story and what led you to write this book? Because obviously a lot of the books that you've written and a lot of your work has been academic, research oriented, and you've done a lot of work. You've done a lot of writing and talking about racism especially as it manifests in the digital sphere. And so I'm curious about why you sort of came to a personal story now and trying to bring it more into the personal and intimate world, that white women live in, are socialized into, and then wind up, sort of acting out and reinforcing white supremacy through.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. You're right. I've written a lot of academic stuff. I've been interested in white supremacy sort of from this intellectual perspective for going on 30 years now. And that started when I was in graduate school at the University of Texas at Austin. I was born and raised in Texas, and that's where my family is from. And part of the reason I mention that is because in the process of writing a dissertation about white supremacy, I was with family at a great aunt's house, and I pulled a book off the shelf, and it was Thomas Dixon's The Klansman. And I asked her why she had that book, and she said, "Oh, I don't know. I think it was your grandfather's, her brother's." And I opened it, and sure enough, his name was in the flyleaf in the cover of it. I said, "Well, why did he have this book?" And she said, "Oh, he was in that group, honey." I was blown away by that response. And my father happened to be there at the time, and I asked him, "Did you know this?" Because I was writing a dissertation about, Klan groups and that sort of thing. He said, "Yeah, it was no big deal. They were just trying to help people." And that news, even though my family tried to minimize it and play it down, really, really rocked me. It really shook me to my core personally in a lot of different ways. Because part of my story also is that grandfather is the grandfather that had molested me when I was a small child, about 4 or 5. And I was just really troubled by this, like not only intellectually trying to figure it out, but emotionally trying to come to terms with it. Part of what happened after that discovery, and as I finished graduate school and went on to do a postdoctoral fellowship, and that dissertation became my first book, which is called White Lies, I started thinking about the fact that my last name, which my last name was Harper, was going to be on this book that was coming out about white supremacy. And I just thought, I can't do that. And I started thinking about changing my name just to distance myself from my grandfather. It was his last name as well. And then I never really liked my first name, which was Suzanne. And I thought, well, I'm going to change my name, both first and last name. And when I did that, I decided before I published this book, I was going to change my name. I wrote a preface to that first book and sort of situating myself. I'd studied with Patricia Hill Collins, who did Black feminist thought. And one of her big insights is, you need to, there's no objective social science, that you always have to position yourself in relation to the research. So I wrote this preface about my research, that it was going to go before the book. And I sent it to my dad thinking that he would be proud of my writing, and told him that I was changing my name. Instead of being proud of me and saying, atta girl, he had me locked in a psych ward for 72 hours. Fortunately, my brother came and vouched for me and my sanity and got me out. And I went on to publish the book and didn't speak to my father for the 2 years after that. And then he died in an accident 2 years later. So I say it's all a very long story, but I say that to say this, which is that for me, untangling white supremacy is really a very, very personal issue for me. And I think that while some people may think it's, think of me as a kind of unicorn, like who has a Klan granddaddy that also molested them, I think it's actually a very common story. We know that childhood sexual abuse is really common. And we also know that in the 1920s, there were anywhere from 2 to 4 million people active in the Ku Klux Klan in this country. And presumably all those people had children and grandchildren. So I think I'm actually not that unusual. I think it's a pretty American story.
Mm-hmm. I'm so grateful to you for sharing your story with us. And and I find your story so powerful, and I've heard parts of it before. And I just appreciate you being so honest and open with us and with people in general. Especially because I think that a lot of times white scholars, especially in the world of writing about race or white supremacy or the history, America's racial history, do not really either know or are not open about their own personal connection, and yet many, if not all, I think have, a personal connection that would kind of add insight into the way that, kind of white people feel affected, and therefore some then go out and try to become more involved in, overcoming racism, as you just showed us that book,
Francesca.
Yeah,
I think a lot of white scholars who are doing this kind of research, it really actually comes from a kind of place of white saviorism, where they're not talking about their own positionality, their own place in the research, and their own relationship to white supremacy. And so I really hope to encourage other people to be able to do this kind of investigation of their own place in the world.
And as you're saying that, Jesse, what's coming for me is that is because of white supremacy and patriarchy, because it is an individual endeavor, because it is the meritocracy, it is the whole rugged individualism conceptualization of what it means to be accountable or responsible for my piece of the pie over here, or for just my little limited piece. And, this other, sort of leaning into the relational and the collective piece is very much the indigenous, ancestral, sort of more, organic, if you will, holistic, whatever name you want to use, way of interacting with structures and systems, and then finding our way back into balance. Because I always find it fascinating that psychotherapy often is so focused on a piece without taking into account all of the ingredients that are part of what makes the pie. And so if you do mindfulness, training or work like I've been trained in, for example, when you think about, I'll use Thich Nhat Hanh as an example. He's a very well-known, Zen Vietnamese teacher. And he says a paper, he holds up a piece of paper, and he says, he writes beautiful calligraphy and poems. And he says, what's on the piece of paper? What is this? A cloud, the rain, a tear. Everything is contained in this piece of paper. The universe is in the piece of paper. So when we look at this paper with the reverence of the connectedness of what that is and what that means, anything can be born and everything dies in this piece of paper. Because when we're finished with our book, it goes into the earth and it is regenerated as, so it's this piece of like, we're part of a moving system. We are not these isolated little things. And I think that that is part of what is problematic, obviously, about the system of white supremacy that you're so beautifully working to unpack and to educate folks about.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think there's also something about the way that I was taught feminism. I really became a feminist, fairly late in life. My mother certainly wasn't a feminist, but I discovered it, kind of after her death when I was 21, and then through graduate school. But part of the way that I was taught feminism was that we as women were only victims, that we were only oppressed by patriarchy. But at the same time, I was learning about and reading, Ida B. Wells talking about, in her great work, The Red Record, talking about lynching in this country and how, the mythology about white women's purity and, need for protection was part of what allowed and enabled lynching to happen. And that often included the sexual mutilation of Black men. And it just made me wonder what was the advantage of thinking of myself as a victim if the way that I, as a white woman, was being constructed was part of what enabled the violence against, Black people, including Black men. It just didn't make sense to me. So intellectually, that's been part of my quest, is to really understand how the patriarchal part of my upbringing, connected with the white supremacist part of my upbringing.
And I just want to jump in there, right? Because I think when I was taking a class about white women finding freedom, combating our own white supremacy, I learned more about Carolyn Bryant, who's the woman who accused Emmett Till of whistling at her in a store, and therefore, they found his body in the Tallahatchie River, and we had the open casket, and that was really sort of the George Floyd of that moment, and continues to be. And now we have, unfortunately, a continuation of that legacy, and that she recanted her story of what had happened, that the men, including her husband, that were there in the all-white trial were immediately, let go. And that it was also learned that, he abused her. It was actually her husband that was a physical abuser, not a 14-year-old boy. And so this idea of patriarchy being part and parcel, to your point early on about your grandfather, who's the Klansman, being the abuser and the molester, I think is really kind of important for people to understand that what we're talking about here is a system of power, and about who is taking it and what it really needs to happen, to go back into balance. And that white women's place has been to ally with patriarchy there through marriage and through systemic legal things that we know, anti-miscegenation laws and all of that, for years, that prohibited what would otherwise be a natural love between people of different ethnicities and backgrounds.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. There's a way in which, like you mentioned, Carol Bryant, and I think that that's a really great way to segue into talking about more contemporary examples, like the Karens that you mentioned at the top of the show. And everybody, I've had lots of conversations with journalists who are sort of puzzled, like, what's going on? Like, has something recently happened? And, part of my work is to connect the current, discussion and memification, if you will, of Karens, like Central Park Karen, who, called the police on Christian Cooper in Central Park in May. It was actually the same day that George Floyd was killed. And she called the police on Christian Cooper, who was doing nothing except telling her to leash her dog. And there, to me, there's a direct line between Carolyn Bryant, accusing Emmett Till of, what at the time was considered inappropriate behavior, and Amy Cooper calling the police, calling 911, and threatening this Black man in Central Park with his life, saying, well, I'm going to call the police and tell them that, I'm being threatened by an African-American man. And then she, in the video, you see her actually call 911, and you can hear her voice, you hear the inflection in her voice change so that she's portraying victimhood, and so, I mean, part of what I'm really interested in exploring is sort of how we as white women get invested in this idea of ourselves as victims, right? And I think that there's a way in which, the way that we've been taught feminism, which oftentimes is not from an intersectional approach, doesn't include sort of different perspectives on feminism, pushes white women to the center and pushes our experience and our fears and our concerns to the center of the discussion. And I think that the time for that has passed. You know, we need to have a different discussion now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I had so many thoughts when you were talking, and now I'm not quite sure which way to go because I have so many questions. But one thing I'm wondering about is sort of in terms of kind of trying to understand sort of where white women sort of get their ideas about you know, their own or our own entitlement, you know, to people, to things, to power, you know, and yet at the same time see ourselves as quite, you know, victimized or kind of fragile or in need of protection or unsafe. You know, like that these two things exist simultaneously in sort of a white female American consciousness and are really effective at kind of keeping the status quo of white supremacy going, because you're both sort of in a position of being like Miss Anne, which is like which is like an old African American saying from the South of describing white women as being, you know, kind of the head of a household who then has a number of either enslaved people or household servants who she then is like kind of in charge of and, you know, exploiting, directing, and, you know, like the movie The Help comes to mind. And so this idea of Miss Anne, kind of who is like a very kind of like maybe very manicured and beautiful on the outside, and yet underneath is a sort of very brutal, just kind of female version of slave owner. You know, that you can both have a Miss Anne and this kind of, you know, woman who's in danger of being, you know, raped or overwhelmed or victimized in some way. And like that these two archetypes like exist simultaneously, and they really do filter down into the present, into how people see themselves. And I think feminism, in my experience, especially a certain kind of feminism that I feel like was very much part of like sort of a 90s, some part of 90s feminism that was sort of like almost like a corporate feminism, like you can do anything you want, you can break the glass ceiling, you can, you know, kind of do whatever a man does, you can bring home the bacon and fry it up in a pan kind of thing. Like there's this idea that you should be empowered, and that includes having power over other people. And at the same time, you should see yourself as someone who's going to be like sort of marginalized by society, or that your ability to kind of make an equal wage is going to be, you know, always something you'll have to fight for. Reproductive rights are going to be something you'll have to fight for. And like, you know, there's some truth in all of these things. And yet the combination of it is, I think, what creates this kind of white feminism that is deeply unintersectional and really,
Yeah,
you know, undergirds. And so I guess I'm curious about sort of if you know, how we could sort of talk about that as starting earlier, you know, like this kind of idea of being like sort of primed to be a woman who directs her fancy wedding and kind of runs her house, and like these kind of ways in which we're socialized to have a beautiful home that might be, you know, featured in Architectural Digest, or like make sure that your, you know, vagina is steamed or whatever. And, you know, like also be like, you know, and someone that kind of needs protection, or like should be really yeah, I don't know exactly, needs safe space, or, you know, kind of needs to tell other people like who are not white to make sure you're not like stepping on your toes by, you know, making sure they're not being sexist, you know, or critiquing other people's misogyny, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it's impossible in the American context to talk about white women and white supremacy and not begin that conversation around slavery. There's a wonderful book by a scholar named Stephanie Jones Rogers called "They Were Her Property," and she really does a deep historical dive into the way that white women were especially brutal in their practice of you know, owning slaves. and and I think that there is a way in which that, you know, at the same time that white women were portrayed as in danger around people who were enslaved, right? And so I think that twin sort of dynamic that you're pointing to is deep in the sort of socialization that we get as white women, that we are both um, destined to be leaders. I mean, I think you hear that in the kind of feminism that's packaged around lean in feminism, you know, the Sheryl Sandberg book, and that whole there's a whole campaign around that. That's deeply not intersectional. But I think that being a boss, you know, the sort of boss culture, really goes back to slaveholding, and that's where that boss culture, you know, originates in a way. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and at the same time, we're taught again and again by both the patriarchy and by feminism that women are inherently victims, or white women are inherently victims in need of protection, in need of protection. And I think that those two things are sort of always operating for white women. And I think it's a very confusing place to be. I think it in part, you sort of alluded to the steaming of vaginas and that sort of thing. I think it's part of what gives rise to the wellness industry. I think there's something about the kind of set of white womanhood, the sort of what it takes to be a successful white lady is to be both a leader and a victim, that that requires a kind of industry to help with that. And I think that's where we get the kind of Gwyneth Paltrow-ish wellness industry that's really about, you know, kind of attending to a particular form of white ladyhood. You know, it's saying who we are is in need of a particular kind of care and attention to sustain itself. Um, and I think in a way, you know, what that suggests is that the subject position, to use an academic term, but the subject position of being a white lady is really tenuous, you know, because it has these contradictions in it always. I'll just tell one quick story. I teach at Hunter College, which is situated on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and it's actually in one of the richest zip codes, wealthiest zip codes in the country. And sometimes on the way to getting there from uptown, I will take a bus down Lexington Avenue. And what this is in the before time, before the current pandemic, but what you see play out on that bus are really the dynamics of colonialism and slavery replayed in the contemporary era, where many of the very, very wealthy families on the Upper East Side are employing domestic help, either as nannies or housekeepers, who are women from the Caribbean and from the islands. And those Black women taking care of these white children are also taking orders from these white children. You know, I have heard more than once, you know, 4 and 5-year-old white children tell their fully grown Caribbean nannies that they're the boss of them, you know, that they will have them fired. They will tell their parents if they don't, you know, let them do what they want to do. You know, so these dynamics continue to play out, you know, where even small children are being reared in the ways of, you know, being masters over Black and brown people. At the same time, we're also being taught to fear them. And so I think that that's a real dynamic of the way that white supremacy, we get socialized into the ways of white supremacy.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's just a lot that you raised there, including the whole phenomenon of outsourcing the rearing of children to Black and brown women who yes, are exploited, and also the children. It's a learning opportunity for the children to then see the exploitation and internalize this idea of like who's the boss and who isn't the boss, who's the boss and who's the worker.
One of the other important things that I want to raise, though, about white supremacy and the way that we learn it as white people is that it's also like inextricably linked with love, like what we think of as love. So you'll often hear white people who were raised, you know, in part by, you know, some woman who is Black or brown talk about their love for for that nanny, for that woman of color. And I don't doubt that at all. But the thing that often gets left out of that conversation is also that they held power over that woman, and so that to me is it's a very twisted form of love that gets wrapped up in white supremacy. And I mean, that's part of what I'm trying to unravel in my work as well, and in my writing, is sort of how, we have in white families this, what I think of as the intergenerational transmission of white supremacy. And that comes not just in thinking about, racial epithets, or learning that, certain people are unclean or whatever, like the sort of crude racism. It also comes up through the way that we're taught to love, and that to me seems like one of the most twisted and psychologically damaging aspects of white supremacy.
Absolutely. And I think that that's an important piece that I think your work, and like this book in particular that you're writing, really highlights, because you and I have talked about Reverend Thandeka and her work around, or her writing about how, kind of being bred white and being raised white involves this trauma, or this this wound where, your natural kind of love that is very much like kind of not polluted by ideas of race is taken away from you by your own family members, and you have to sacrifice that in order, and that's the price you have to pay in order to get the love from the people that you are related to and depend on for survival. And I think your story, of course, is a very stark example of that, because when you came forward with your own sort of statement of like, actually, I don't support white supremacy, you were immediately punished. Yeah. And so I think that's a really important part, is like, this idea of like these white children on the bus kind of like psychologically, kind of bossing around, their caregiver, is so poignant for the caregiver, but perhaps even more so for the kids, because like these kids are being raised in a way that they're sort of learning how to deprive themselves of actual love. Because I think my experience speaking with women who work as caregivers and nannies for white families is often that like they actually they will develop caring feelings for the children, because of course they do, but they've learned through experience that they can't be too loving, because inevitably the white mother or father will betray them and they will remove them from the kids. And I think that's like this whole history in the US of separating families. We have such a long history with that, starting with, English children who were kidnapped and sent over to work as indentured servants or whatever they were calling them. So like this idea of there being no real bond and no real love in white supremacy, I think is very true. And I think it is something you're taught at a very young age, which is not to say that white people don't love their children and white children don't receive love, but it gets mixed in with some very like confused and debilitating on some level with your own ability to have empathy, to have true mutual, relationships.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, that there's something about, if you're raised thinking of love as somehow wrapped in domination and power, that there's something wrong about that kind of love. There's something that's not authentic about that kind of love, and it's really damaging. And I think that part of what we've talked about before in reading Reverend Thandeka and her work, thinking about the damage that goes on in families when they're raising their children in the ways of white supremacy, is how I've come to think of it. What's the kind of damage that we're doing to children when we're raising them that way? I think, since we're talking really to psychotherapists and psychologists, I think there are lots of ways in psychotherapy now to think about sort of coming to terms with the damage that, having a an abuser in the family, a sexual abuser, like there are volumes and volumes written about that, and I have done that therapy and grateful for that work. But in working on my own issues, like it's been hard to find, you know, therapists or people who are thinking about the damage that was done to me by my grandfather being in the Klan, and so that is kind of the conversation that I'm hoping to expand. And I'm grateful to you, Natasha, for your work on that, and your discussions about that kind of work. I think, and both of you raising these issues, I think is really, really important.
Thanks, Jesse. As you were talking earlier, one of the things that came up for me, and I sort of was searching for it, and then I finally found it, was this Jacqueline Badalora book, Birth of a White Nation. And I've interviewed her recently, and that should be coming out on the Rerooted podcast pretty soon. And in it, she really details all the ways in which legally and historically, over the course of the founding of, quote unquote, the United States of America on Turtle Island, which is actually the land that we're on. I'm on Nipmuc land right now in Massachusetts, unceded, not even, part of any honoring treaty or anything. And so this is not really ours to be taking, just like people's bodies are not ours to be taking, just like women's bodies are not ours to be raping. But in this structure of whiteness and patriarchy and supremacy and greed, which comes out of the trauma of a lot of white Anglo individuals from, whatever you want to call it, Europe or whatever that area was, comes out of their oppression and their trauma coming here. They're not being sort of attuned to in a certain way, coming here and creating and reproducing a system that has essentially, I think, a dissociative and avoidant attachment disorder, which is part of what we see with defensiveness and numbness and, the intellectualization and all of that. And so to this point in this book, I think this idea of, really what she makes clear is African American women, women of African descent, were made capital and instruments of wealth production because of the ways in which any white man could rape a Black woman and own all of the children as capital and property in perpetuity for lifetimes upon lifetimes. And that white women were made bearers of purity and thus instruments of white supremacy. And I think this piece around we needed Black women to be the scapegoats and the Jezebels for white women to have purity, and that there were fewer white women when the colonies were being started, because basically everybody died initially. 5,000 people died, 6,000 people died. Nobody really survived. And then they kind of kept on importing people. And with that came a few women here and there kind of was a toehold among the white European descended folks that were colonizing Turtle Island, that white women were scarce. And there was a desire to, A, have sex, and B, have sex with who was available, right? And then the categorization around the race, the categorization around the ownership and the property was such that it went into places where, okay, right, so if a white woman marries or is with a Black man, she loses her citizenship. She loses her children. She's no longer entitled. She becomes herself enslaved as a white person. So again, I just think that most psychologists, most therapists, most people that I know in general, even if you're in the helping professions, they don't know this. Like, this is the seed of why, this is the deeper root. I didn't know it. But this is where the seeds of Karenness, of Becky-ness come from, because it's incumbent to have vaginal steaming in order to preserve your purity so that you're not the one who gets associated with rape and enslavement and in perpetuity ownership of children. You see, so there has to be a demarcation and differentiation line. And that happens through the legalization over centuries and centuries and centuries, including for Black women specifically, not having the right to vote until, 50 years ago, right? Really? So white women had it, Black women did not. And so these things are not really common knowledge. And I mean, I don't even know that people know that we don't even have the ERA. The Equal Rights Amendment didn't pass. Women in the United States of America / Turtle Island do not have equal rights. And so what's operative is this power systemic system. And it comes out in wanting to regenerate, wanting to replicate like a cancer. And so in that way, what are we doing to be not within the system thinking about it, but looking with a panoramic awareness about the system itself from a wider lens, from a more sort of embodied viewpoint around what are we really doing here? Because at the conclusion of this book, she, among others, including Daryl Wing Sue, who Natasha, you're the one who introduced me to, but obviously is extremely well known in his field, who wrote everything about microaggressions, overcoming our racism, he says white people are victims too, and especially white women because of the intersectionality there, but also, of course, not the same kind of trauma, because this is not the trauma Olympics of Black women, of Black trans women today, of, people of different, social classes and whatnot. And that there's a real, that what you were talking about with kids and with people and, where you can just watch a lynching. You said 2 to 4 million people were part of the KKK in the 1920s and they had families. Yes, they go on dates and watch a lynching. That was theater. This is a human being, but it's systematized around the dehumanization with everything from, Blumenbach and, Linnaeus and craniums and intellectual capacity and all these other crazy things that are just fake news that are put into people to kind of perpetuate this system. So I just want to pull back and say there are very, very specific reasons that this was seeded and sealed that come up with where we are today. So Amy Cooper feels entitled to call the cops on a Black man who's bird watching in Central Park. And that this business of protecting our purity is very much around I will not be the raped. I will be the one who has abortion at my access. I will be the one who has a choice and, for freedom. And I'm not saying that that's wrong. I'm saying that I get access to my choices and I have agency, but it's still within a system of oppression.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we've talked a lot about the sort of founding the country and the roots of this society in slavery and in genocide. And it's absolutely, some of the root causes of the way that white women, some of the root causes of Karenness, if we could say that, and it's also part of what's implicated in colonialism. So it's not only the U.S. There's also a global phenomenon to white supremacy as well, and I think it's important to name that. The other thing I wanted to say just about systems and bringing it back to the calling of 911, which we've seen not only with this person, Amy Cooper in Central Park, but we've seen it time and time again with white women. There was a woman who got referred to, Jennifer Schulte, who got referred to as Barbecue Becky in Oakland, who called the police, called 911 on a Black family that was setting up a barbecue grill in a public park in Oakland. And part of what I want to get people to think about in the pulling back from these sort of tiny individual examples of, what I call white women behaving badly is the system that they're plugging into, right? Which is the 911 system. And that system itself is really, in a way, designed for us as white women. So you may be familiar with Kitty Genovese's story, which was a murder of a white woman, actually a lesbian who was killed in Kew Gardens, Queens, in the night. I'm going to forget the exact year, but the 1960s. And it was actually a Black man who assaulted her and killed her. And it was following that a lot of people were very upset that people had maybe heard or seen or overheard what was happening to her, and they didn't call the police. There's some conflicting reports about that since it happened, saying maybe there weren't that many people that actually heard it. But there was a great outcry that she had been murdered. And in the wake of that, there was a real push to nationalize and create the 911 system so that never happened again. And in a recent documentary about the Kitty Genovese story, her brother actually claims that the 911 system is what the family sees as one of the big successes, or victories that came out of her murder, that at least we have this 911 system. And so in some ways, what I want to suggest is that the 911 system itself is really designed for the protection of white women. It's so that never happens again to another white woman who was attacked by a Black man. And so I think we really have to rethink, our current policing, our current incarceration system, which in a lot of ways, it's off the charts how many people we incarcerate in the United States. And in so many ways, that's done in our name as white women. That's done for our protection. And I think we really just have to rethink these systems that are in some ways, at least partially, designed to protect us and for our safety. And I think that really has to be reconsidered.
Mhm. And I mean, I think that sort of dovetails obviously with what Francesca was saying, which is that there's such a deprivation and lack of education and awareness about the history of the different sort of systems, and that we now look at as, you know, even if people are aware that there's certain, you know, there's a history of racism or a history of genocide, you know, the information, that the sort of more granular information that has the capacity to kind of open people's eyes and hearts, you know, still is really suppressed in many ways, including in education systems, but even, you know, at the more primary, secondary, college level, but even in the education of therapists. I mean, I've been doing some research about intelligence testing and the statistics and the degree to which the history of eugenics is whitewashed out of that in the education of psychologists and people who do intelligence testing is shocking to me, you know, and I'm someone that, you know, really tries to, you know, be aware of the history and kind of learn the history, and was taught the history sort of in my earlier education because of where I grew up. But I think the other thing that your sort of what you just said brought up for me. So I think that the education piece is really important. And then I also think the sort of myth busting is very important, because this idea that, you know, 911 was created for women's safety, for white women's safety, I think that that's the myth. But 911 doesn't keep white women safe either. You know, the murders by intimate partners or strangers of women in general, trans women, of white women, of women of all colors, continues unabated. You know, like, I don't think the numbers have gone down very much since Kitty Genovese was killed. And, you know, I don't think 911 did jack shit, and I don't think the police did anything either. You know, like that, because this myth that white women's safety is upheld under white supremacy is a myth,
Yeah.
you know? And so, I mean, it is to some extent in terms of economics, in terms of like, there are privileges without a doubt, but I think that it's important for white women to really begin to understand in a more realistic way what the cost is they're paying, but also what they're getting for that, you know, and because safety is not it.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and it makes me think of this wonderful new book by Jane Ward called "The Tragedy of Heterosexuality," in which she talks about the way the eugenicists in the late 19th century and early 20th century, the sort of marriage repair industry was all about sort of getting men and women to sort of agree to this bargain of heterosexuality, and the way that she goes into like marriage manuals and that sort of thing, the self-help industry of that time, and the way that, you know, the saving heterosexuality was really about saving the white family, and so this bargain that we've struck, you know, as white women, is really not helping us. You know, I mean, I think the point that you make about abuse in relationships and intimate partner violence is a really good one, to think about where the danger is. You know, the danger is in our families, you know, and I think we have to take a hard look at that as white women to see where the danger actually is. It's in our families.
Right. And it's coming from white women, other white women, and white men.
Exactly.
Right. And from a trauma perspective, I mean, I think that one of the things I think about a lot is, you know, when you talk about like preserving the white family, sort of like that being the impetus, and, you know, sort of the fear of the I don't know, violence that could, you know, potentially be perpetrated by the other. When we look at our amygdala, our neuroscience, our nervous system, our fight, freeze, fix, fornicate, all these sort of, you know, bottom up approaches and whatnot, there's a reason why people don't want to go in and do some of this work and unpack it. It's not pleasant. And so if you don't actually have a way to hold yourself as you go into these learnings or leanings, whether it's about incest in your own family, whether it's about something that's you know, knowingly sort of in a certain part of you, cognitively dissonating, you know, your abuse of your Jamaican nanny, like the whole idea of sort of selling your soul out for the power of whiteness. Dr. Carol Gilligan at NYU talks about we sacrifice relationships for relationship in the hierarchy, meaning I'm better or worse than you. So I'm in this zip code and that's better than going down here in that zip code. And to your point about Hunter, I have this pocketbook and this, Range Rover, and you have a Toyota. And that means something to me in this system. And so I'm willing to sacrifice, including incest and the silence around internal family abuse. I'm willing to silence that and swallow that because it's more important to me to have access to the goodies and the financial access that my, banker husband has. And so it's this whole system that gets set up. And I think what the reckoning is from a trauma perspective is learning how to hold and mourn and grieve and reckon with the truth of how this is actually hurting me. It's sort of like eating the Doritos and the Twinkies every day for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Eventually, your body is not going to take well to that. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with eating them. I'm saying that that can't be your steady diet if you generally want to have, I think, an optimal, balanced, microbiome, right? And so if that's the case, we need to kind of be willing to take into account our own health and well-being and agency and see this not as a quick fix or even in our lifetime fix, but in something that from a mindfulness perspective, we're pointing the compass of our heart toward a wider lens and the, sort of 500-year peace plan, that like after a civil war, I think it was in Sri Lanka, they said, we're going to have a 500-year peace plan. This isn't going to get fixed overnight. So when people talk about, like Angela Davis just published a big piece on abolishing prisons and the police and the whole system, to your point, Jesse, the whole idea around really looking at what are we doing going forward? Because right now, I think we're just taking the hit here and we just are sort of like, oh, give me the white supremacy for now because it's an easy place and I can find my social location and I can take all my privilege and I can navigate this world and I can always be on top of someone else. But at the end of the day, how much of that, like bile in our systems, eats away at us? Cancer, diabetes, all these kinds of things, as well as because capitalism has a solution for that. Let me give you more pills. Let me zone you out. And I'm not saying that some people don't need those things. They do. I'm saying that there's also a solution there to say, well, let's not actually feel the remorse. Let's not actually go into the place. And I don't think it can be done alone. I think that this is something that has to be done collectively and white women joining together to lean into this work and actually look at what they're doing in their small parenting groups, in their pods now, because we're in COVID and everybody's doing their teaching from home and whatever it is, really can have it incumbent on them to say, yeah, what is this going to mean for us to show up today? I have clients all the time telling me, my husband doesn't know, and they make a lot of money, these clients. My husband doesn't have any idea as a white educated man who is able to be an entrepreneur, what it's like to be a woman. The world's handed to him in a way. So there's resentment right there, the privilege there, but then also the access is there. There's not an investigation of racism there, but there's also the resentment around, and so I think that that's a whole other piece, but we have to do it together. I don't think it can be it starts with an individual, but I do feel like the name of the show that we're doing right now, I do think it has to kind of come from the inside out, an ability to hold a reckoning and the grief and the remorse of what it's like to actually take stock of what the hell has been going on.
Yeah, that's such a great point that you raised. One of the chapters in my book, The Nice White Ladies, is the lie that's killing us. And I actually talk about some of the embodied damage that this lie of whiteness does for us. There's a great book by Jonathan Metzl called Dying of Whiteness, where he sort of looks at the way that certain policies become stand-ins for white identity and that people are literally willing to die for them, whether it's healthcare or gun laws or education reform. And part of what I see with white people is there's according to the epidemiology, we have a declining lifespan. White people, our lifespan is actually shortening, which is a weird thing. It's an anomaly. It doesn't usually happen in epidemiology that once society gets, clean running water, good sanitation, that lifespans continue to increase. But in the last, I think it's about 15 or so years, lifespans for whites have been going down. And part of that, people have talked about this research by researchers at Princeton, whose name I'm forgetting now, talking about deaths of despair. And these are, deaths from alcohol, drugs, opioids, and suicide. And those are especially hitting women sort of in the middle years, especially hard. In fact, we know that suicide rates for white women are going up in those middle-aged years. And that again is something that's really personal for me. My mother died by suicide when she was 48. And, I spent a lot of time in therapy talking about the impact that her death had on me, continues to have on me. And there are lots of ways in which my therapist has been, completely well equipped to talk about how gender shaped my mother's life and shaped my own response to her death. But it's only recently, and at my insistence, that we've been able to begin to explore the ways that whiteness shortened her life. And I think that that's something that we really have to begin to think about, is what's the damage done to us around and through whiteness and our buying into white supremacy. What are we giving up in terms of our own health and happiness to buy into this lie of white superiority?
Yeah, very beautifully put. And again, I'm really so grateful to you for being so open and kind of candid about your own story, because I think it really, hopefully gives permission to people who hear you to begin to make these connections and to be more open with themselves and other people around them about, really like how they think that this might be working in their own lives. Because I think there's often this, I hear a lot from people that I work with in therapy, this idea of like, I don't have real problems. And I think that's a real, like, kind of sort of interesting sort of side
It's almost
effect.
like a flag for whiteness.
Yeah, it's like, well, I mean, first of all, a lot of these people do have real problems, but they're not problems of privilege. Like their privilege protects them from what they would call real problems. And in some ways, that's something that they use to comfort themselves with, but it also comes with a lot of guilt. But it also is a way of avoiding the things that whiteness takes away, which is sort of a connectedness, a sense of purpose that isn't just kind of contaminated with this kind of white supremacist striving, trying to climb up the ladder, define yourself in relationship to other people. The compare and despair, and there's a lot of other elements too, but, and we didn't really get to talk enough about, I think, sexuality, women's sexuality, which I think is such a big part of the way that whiteness is sort of constructed, both in its oppressive terms externally and also internally. But, and conformity, which I think is a big part of why, like I have a guy that I work with who is also from Texas and actually is queer. And we sort of talk a lot about how in this individualistic society, the irony is that you are not allowed to be an individual within your own family. Within the family, you have to conform totally and sort of cut off the parts of yourself which are really any aspect of yourself that doesn't fit into this very narrow definition of what is sort of acceptable. And and a lot of that comes with like sort of a laundry list of psychologically unhealthy, spiritually unhealthy correlates, like not being able to go for help, not being able to ask or receive help, not being able to like give or receive love in an authentic way, not being able to kind of connect with other people in an authentic way that isn't organized around power. Like there's so many things that kind of go along with that, but it is also this kind of reducing of people to a kind of template that is very not about an individual's kind of who you are as an authentic individual, but how well you can conform to a very narrow identity and then go out in the world and try to impose that on identity on everyone else. And so there's kind of this policing that happens internally that then kind of gets grafted onto the culture itself and expressed out in the culture. And one thing that I find fascinating is the degree to which white people use 911 on each other as well as on people of color, the difference being that it's a lot less lethal and there isn't a whole system of incarceration that then, you know, like the consequences are much less severe, but the act of calling police on people as opposed to just sort of trying to have conflict resolution with people is super normalized,
Yeah.
you know, and that's really important too for kind of beginning to grow people's awareness around like what would a more healthy and less oppressive way of being white or wife.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I think that's why when you look at indigenous and you look at more ancestral ways of, achieving justice, and you look at restorative justice circles, when you look at the call to, I think we're posting that article from Angela Davis about abolishing the prisons and whatnot, that there are other ways of achieving accountability. We're talking about accountability and remorse. We're not talking about punitive judgment. And that's the difference between the supremacy angle versus the collective liberation. When we feel like we're separate and we're not part of one another, then we feel as though I can do whatever I need to do in my own place and it's not going to affect you. When in fact, we're never not in relationship, even with our oppressors, even with our people that we strongly dislike. I will stay away from the H word, but the people who, sort of poke us. And so to that end, I think it's very important to just recognize that we have to think of other models. So when we hear things like defunding the police, when we hear things like abolishing prisons, it's because the model itself is conducive to, call 911 and you don't get murdered, but you also don't have to learn how to cultivate an ability to personally address accountability and conflict without, getting into a shame spiral or erupting in anger and doing a stand your ground, situation. So I just think that that's, again, a structural piece. Jesse, some words from you before we kind of wind down here.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say about this. I just want to thank you both for having me and for facilitating this conversation. I'm always reminded, sort of like, people often ask me, where does this leave us? And I'm often reminded of this great James Baldwin quote that, and he was one of the people that I call on, who talked about the lie of whiteness. And he said, the thing for white people is that, you have to let go of this lie of whiteness so that you're out here dancing and struggling with all the rest of us. And I feel like that's the part of this that white people often forget, is that there's joy on the other side of this, and it's dancing and struggling along with everybody else. And that's what we're trying to get to.
Beautiful. I love that. And one of our previous shows was about Black joy and, being mindful of cultural appropriation versus appreciation. And then another thing that folks can do, especially white women, go back and find your own ancestral history and your own rituals, your own Celtic, shamanic women. I mean, women were burned at the stake for this kind of stuff. I mean, the Salem witches. I mean, this is the whole thing. So anyway, I could go on, but I won't because it's time. Natasha, final words from you.
Well, yeah, I just want to say thank you so much to Jesse and also to you, Francesca and Brian, for just sort of making this all happen, because I think it's just really special and unusual to have the opportunity to really dig so deeply into some of these topics that we're talking about. And I think that, Francesca, to your point, like there is a whole history, going back hundreds, if not thousands of years of people resisting oppression, including white European descended women, European women. So, like we can, if we're feeling defeated or hopeless or getting into a shame spiral, there are certainly ways, and one of those ways is through like broadening our awareness of what our history is, not just as women and as white people, but as human beings, what we have access to, if we can kind of sort of take ourselves slightly outside of the lie of whiteness and see what else is out there.
The whole world outside of it, to be honest, and the whole universe, and also space-time, not even just like October 7th, 2020, but also, back and forward, meaning we're stardust. So let's get a grip. It's really not all that serious, and yet it's always very serious. And so with that said, Jesse, Natasha, I'm Francesca. Thanks to all the viewers. Please drop some comments if you like. I'm also going to ask Bryant to throw in the comment section the link to one of the classes that I found was helpful: Online Finding Freedom, White Women Taking on Our Own White Supremacy by Evangeline Weiss and Carrie Points. And they are offering this course in cycles. So they had an October offering that's happening. And I also did a podcast with them on Rerooted on the Ram Dass Be Here Now Network, which you're welcome to tune into. You can find that on my website, Maximé Clarity, Maxime Clarity, CLARITY.com also. And I just want to note again that Jessie, her book is Nice White Ladies, The Truth About White Supremacy, our role in it, again, taking ownership and how we can help dismantle it. And so thank you again to everyone for tuning in, and be well.
Thank you to everybody.
Thank you for watching Inside Out with Natasha and Francesca here on Solivity TV every Wednesday at noon. Solivity Magazine brings you the best in inspiration on Solivity TV. Check out our new shows. Mark your calendars for Solivity Magazine shows by going to solivity.com now. Welcome to your new you with Aspire by Solivity. Virtual inspiration for your mind, body, and soul. With the help of at-home experts and celebrity guests, Aspire by Solivity provides tools to tap into the passion and purpose that lives within you. Find classes to educate and motivate you, from nutrition to your body and a whole lot more. So, take the leap. Start your new journey with Aspire by Solivity today. Sign up now.